go. Okay, so good evening for our last session. I have to tell you something funny. Um, uh, Chabad is also offering a series of classes on Jewish mythology, which I thought was pretty funny. So
Oh,
I copied the announcement that they sent out, and I sent it to Rabbi Lotker, and I said, "Look what Chabad is doing." Well, without looking at it carefully, I just sent it out, and apparently it auto corrected to Chad. Look
yeah.
what
So,
Chad is doing, and so he looked at it like, "What?"
yeah, who's Chad? I thought maybe it was one of your congregants
For the
or
country
Riverside.
of Chad.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was, yeah. But when I actually searched on the name of the program, it was pretty clear that
That's hilarious.
I found it was Chabad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so tonight is our last night, and Rabbi Lotker is going to do a slightly longer class to make up for last week. So take her away.
Okay, and we'll say our blessing for study of sacred texts. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I'm going to go to share screen. And I presume you can see the screen. Yes, good. Okay, so actually, again, we are sorry about what happened last week, and I'm going to cover pretty much the same material. I've left out a few slides and planned digressions, but as I mentioned last time, I have all 5 sessions when I taught this a few years ago recorded on my website, and then all of the texts are all of the the slides as one giant PDF. So if you want copies of the the texts, you can get them. And it occurred to me, I sit here and I'm just reading and reading and reading and reading, and it may not be the most interesting thing. So I apologize if it kind of gets boring to hear me read all these texts, but these are texts, and I don't know what else to do. So that's what we do, as as your rabbi and all rabbis will say. Judaism is something that's focused on text. I have actually a program. I think I'll show you where it is on my website in a little bit, called Revisiting the Garden of Eden with a Jewish Tour Guide. So some of the sort of introductory material is from that talk. But it occurred to me, tonight we're going to be talking about the beginning and the end. So the beginning is Eden, right? And the end is the coming of the Messiah. So in Jewish, tradition, we don't know what happens certainly before the beginning, and we don't know what happens after the Messiah comes. As you'll see, well, there's speculation about it, but we're going to go from the beginning to the end. So I want to talk about before the Garden of Eden and the idea of the Kabbalistic reflection on how the universe was created. So this now is from the Zohar and lots of sources, but it's sort of a description of the creation as viewed in Kabbalah. At the beginning of time, God's presence filled the universe. Then God decided to bring this world into being. To make room for creation, God first drew in his breath, contracting himself. From that contraction, a dark mass was produced. And God said, "Let there be light." The light that came into being entered the dark mass, and 10 vessels came forth, each filled with primordial light. I'm going to make a comment on this. So the 10 vessels are the 10 sphirot. And, one of the digressions that I could do here is the sphirot, which is sort of a tenfold understanding of the nature of God. So clearly the Zohar is playing on this. But basically what's going on here is, before the beginning, the universe was all God and only God. And now God decides to create a physical universe. And, we could spend a few minutes on the question of why God wanted to have a physical universe. And the answers I really like is that God likes stories. God wants company. God wants to be in relationship. Very anthropomorphic projection of God. So God decides to create a physical universe, and God creates a physical universe by withdrawing. The Hebrew term is tzimtzum. God contracts, but not contracts down, but contracts away. So before this, everything is all God and only God, and now God creates a space where the physical universe can exist, and as you'll see, pours divine being through the 10 layers, the 10 sferot, into this space. So in the second paragraph, in this way, God set forth those 10 vessels like a fleet of ships, each carrying its cargo of light. Had they arrived intact, the world would have been perfect. But somehow the frail vessels broke open, split asunder, and all the holy sparks were scattered like sand, like seeds, like stars. The sparks fell everywhere, but more fell in the Holy Land than anywhere else. That is why we were created to gather the sparks, no matter where they are hidden. Some even say that God created the world so that Israel could raise up the holy sparks. And that is why there have been so many exiles, to release the holy sparks from the servitude of captivity. For in this way, the people Israel will sift through all the holy sparks to the four corners of the earth. And when enough holy sparks have been gathered, the vessels will be restored, and the repair of the world awaited so long will finally take place. Therefore, it should be the aim of everyone to raise these sparks from wherever they are imprisoned and to elevate them to holiness by the power of their soul. And when the task of gathering the sparks nears completion, God will hasten the arrival of the final redemption by himself collecting what remains of the holy sparks that went astray. I'll say more about this in a moment. I guess I cut out a whole bunch of stuff. Well, I'm not actually sure what I left in as we're trying to shorten this. So basically, let me back up here. The idea is, as the light entered, as God's presence entered the world, God created vessels to hold God's presence. And there's something called in mystical tradition, Shevirat Kelim, the shattering of the vessels. And so they shatter and they release divine energy, divine sparks. And then there's a description that these sparks are so powerful and holy that they can't exist in a normal way in the world. So they get coatings on the sparks. And then we have this, I would say, Kabbalistic myth that whenever a Jew does a mitzvah, one of these sparks are released and a little bit of the universe is repaired. And it's very Jewish centric, obviously. The fate of the universe depends on Jews doing mitzvot. And so this is one of the reasons I was going to send you a note on this, Suzanne, of why Chabad is so obsessed with this kind of material, because Chabad is heavily influenced by Kabbalah and Zohar and mysticism. So that's why they will, stop Jews on the street, ask men, have you put on tefillin today? And they will have us, put on tefillin. They will give Shabbat candles to women because of this idea that every time a Jew does a mitzvah, a little bit of the universe is healed. Okay, so just to review, broadly speaking, the Garden of Eden myth. So the idea is there is Adam having been created from the Adamah, the earthling created from the earth, and God literally inspires Adam, namely through blowing the breath of life into Adam. Adam becomes a living being. And that raises the question of, what about the woman that was created in the first chapter of Genesis? The second chapter of Genesis is the Garden of Eden. In the first chapter of Genesis, it says God created a man and a woman. And then all of a sudden, we're in the second chapter of Genesis, and they're only talking about Adam. And as you know, we're going to see some surgery. So what happened to that woman? And there are stories of Lilith, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about Lilith. And also this idea that that perhaps the original Adam, sometimes called Adam Rishon, was both male and female. And the surgery was to split this sort of set of Siamese twins into a male and a female. Whoops. And of course, this is a more traditional view that the surgery comes from Adam's rib. And then, of course, there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You can have so much fun finding fun graphics on this. And then, of course, Eve gets into a conversation with the serpent, and then God shows up and asks what happened, and Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. And there they are being expelled, and the way to the Garden of Eden is blocked by a cherub, by a keruv holding a fiery, ever-turning sword. So we're going to talk about some of these myths. And first is this one about Adam the hermaphrodite. Some say Adam was created with two faces, one male and one female, one facing forward and one behind. As it is said, this is in the first chapter of Genesis, male and female, he created them. Others say that Adam and Eve were created as a single being, with Adam in the front and Eve in the back, so that Adam's back was in the shape of Eve. How did this happen? God had originally intended to create two people, but ultimately only one was brought into being. But facing into two directions made walking difficult and conversation awkward. So God changed his mind and split Adam into two, making two backs, one for Adam, one for Eve, and dividing them into two separate beings. There are those that say that Adam lost his second face in a different way through his sin. For when Adam sinned, God took away one of his faces. The commentary is a clear parallel to a Greek myth. I'll just skip over this a little bit. That myth is intended to explain the nature of eros as a craving for completeness, since each person is only part of what he or she once was. The meaning does not really carry over the Jewish version of the myth, except by implication. The closest concept in Judaism is that of beshert, in which every person is said to have a destined one. This grows out of the Talmudic dictum that 40 days before a child is born, a voice goes forth from heaven to declare that this one will marry that one, and that's from the Talmud. My understanding is the word beshert, I think we talked about this, the word beshert comes from a German word, a Yiddish word, which is literally related to the word for shear, someone who is cut out for you. Moving on, the first wedding, I like this. God had already created the earth, the sun, and the moon, and the stars. All the animals were in the Garden of Eden. The time had come for Adam, the first man, to be created. God called upon the angel Gabriel to bring clay from each of the four corners of the earth, the north, the south, the east, and the west. This the angel did, and God formed a clay man and breathed the breath of life into him, and the man opened his eyes and began to breathe. Adam gave names to all the animals and explored the Garden of Eden, but God saw that Adam was lonely, and he decided to create a mate for him. So one day when Adam was strolling in the Garden of Eden, God put Adam to sleep, and while he was deeply dreaming, God took out one of his ribs, and with that rib, God created Eve, the first woman. When Adam awoke and saw Eve standing in front of him, their faces illuminating each other, he understood at once that he had found his true mate. God introduced Adam to Eve and explained how she had been created. Then Adam embraced her and kissed her and said, "This one is at last the bone of my bone and the flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken." Then God knew that the time had come for the world's first wedding. God himself prepared tables of precious pearls and filled them with delicacies. God also created 10 wedding canopies for them, all made of precious gems, pearls, and gold. So did he attire Eve, the first bride, in beautiful wedding dress, and braid her hair and adorn her with 24 different ornaments. As the ceremony began, the ministering angels went and walked before Adam, leading him beneath the wedding canopies. Michael and Gabriel were Adam's groomsmen. Then God himself brought the bride to Adam and stood before them like a cantor, and took up the cup of blessings and blessed them, as it is said, God bless them. As soon as Adam and Eve were wed, still other angels descended to the Garden of Eden, playing music for the newlyweds, beating tambourines and dancing to pipes. So too did the sun, moon, and stars dance for them, and all of creation joined in the celebration of the world's first wedding. Oh, that's a nice wedding story. And now we have the origin of fire in the Garden of Eden. For the first week of creation, the sun shone day and night. But when the sun sank at the end of the Sabbath, the darkness came closer, and Adam grew terrified. He cried out to God that the serpent was coming to harm him. Then God told Adam to take 2 flints and to strike them against each other. And when he did, fire came forth, much to Adam's amazement, and he uttered a spontaneous blessing over it. That's why a blessing is recited over a candle at the end of the Sabbath, for fire was then created the first time. and some commentary about myths of origin, and here the origin of the Havdalah candle. I'd like to talk about the surgery on Adam for a moment. So this is getting away from the text we usually use. So the text says, and Adonai God made Adam fall into a deep sleep, and he slept, and took from one of his ribs the word for rib, the Hebrew word is tsela, and closed up the flesh. So the question is, what is a tsela? It could be a rib, as in a familiar translation, but it can also mean side, and it's used as clearly as side, actually in the description of the construction of the tabernacle. So we get this Siamese twin idea. And so there's another theory by Zioni Zevit, who is a modern Israeli scholar. And he points out that if the woman was actually taken from Adam's rib, we would expect men to have one fewer rib than women, and we know they don't. And in fact, the Israelites were familiar with skeletons, because the way they buried people was they would put them in a grave and seal the grave and come back a year later when the flesh had decayed, and they would gather the bones into the back of the grave in an area called an ossuary. And some scholars believe that the phrase we see a lot in the Bible, that he was gathered to his ancestors or gathered to his kin, and so literally refer to that idea of the ossuary. So they knew that women and men had the same number of ribs. And they were also familiar with animal skeletons because they ate animals. So is there a bone, some of you may know the answer to this, and I may have even spoken to you about it before, which male animals have that female animals have, but the human male does not have? Anybody familiar with this? The bone is the baculum, or the os penis. Most male mammals have a penis bone called the baculum or os penis. The bone is absent in humans and a few kinds of monkeys. So here are some pictures, and yeah, this is a mink, this is a whale, a fox, a coyote, a mouse. Here is a raccoon's. When I give this talk live, Rabbi Singer, you'll appreciate this. I would go through in the crowd and I would say, "This is my penis bone." And I said, "Well, let me explain. It doesn't come from my penis, but I do own it. And it is a penis bone. Therefore, technically, this is my penis bone." And I once handed it to a woman and she freaked out. So I no longer do that. And notice there's a little ring on it. They sell this as jewelry. If you can look for baculum on eBay, and you too can own your own penis bone. So what Zioni Zevit is taking a scholarly perspective on this, that it may well be that was the understanding, that the first Adam had a penis bone, and the woman was created from Adam's penis bone. And it's actually supported by a little more text. It says after the surgery, it says the flesh was closed up at the spot beneath it. V'yasgur basar tachtena. The word tachat means underneath or bottom, like tuchas. So Zevit speculates that this may refer to the perineal raph or scar under the male scrotum. Here's actually a dog and the dog's penis bone. So we can talk about penis bone, but if I had more time, it's a very interesting subject. Okay, so we're going to move on to the forbidden fruit. God told Adam, "Of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die." But Adam told Eve, "God has said you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die." So Adam adds this other phrase, not only don't eat it, but don't even touch it. At that time, the serpent said to himself, perhaps I cannot convince Adam, who heard the words of God, for himself, so I will seek out Eve. The serpent found Eve in the garden and said, "Is it true that God has commanded you not to eat of any fruit in the garden?" And Eve replies, "No, there's only one tree in the midst of the garden forbidden to us. We're not allowed to eat of the tree or even touch it, for on that day we will die." The serpent laughed when he heard this and said, "God has only said this out of jealousy, for he knows that if you eat of the fruit of the tree, your eyes will be open and you will know how to create the world just as he did." And then the serpent went to the midst of the garden and shook it, so that some of the fruit fell to the ground. See, I have touched the tree, and I have not died. She picked up one of the fruits that had fallen, and seeing that it was beautiful and desirable, she tasted it. But no sooner had she taken a single bite that her teeth were set on edge, and she saw the angel of death standing before her with his sword drawn. Then Eve said to herself, now that I've eaten of the fruit, I will die, and Adam, who has not touched it, will live forever, and God will couple him with another woman. It's better that we die together. Of course, what happens, if you read the biblical account, she eats the fruit, and then the very next verse, she gives some of the fruit to Adam, and he eats it. So this explains why she does that very quickly. She didn't want him to remarry after she dies. So when Adam came, she gave him some of the fruit to eat. And as soon as he did, he too saw the angel of death standing before him with a sword drawn. Then Adam knew that the fruit she had given him must have been the forbidden fruit, and he was filled with grief. Others say, and this is the one I like, that the serpent did not wait for Eve to touch the tree, but pushed her against it. See, you have not died. Just as you didn't die from touching the tree, you will not die from eating its fruit. So Eve plucked the fruit and held it up and tasted its skin. When nothing happened, she bit into the fruit, and that's when she saw the angel of death. So one of the interpretations of this myth that I came across is this is where we get a teaching that we shouldn't add more commandments than we need. And of course, the rabbis completely ignore that idea. They add thousands more commandments. Namely, God told Adam, don't eat the fruit. Adam told Chava, her name was actually Chava, not Eve. Adam tells Chava, don't eat it and don't touch it. So when she was pushed into the fruit and she touches it and she didn't die, then she assumed that that she wouldn't die from eating it. More about Adam and Eve and the serpent. In order to convince Eve to taste the forbidden fruit, the serpent said, but God knows as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. Know that God ate of this tree and created the world. That is why he has commanded you not to eat of it, lest you create other worlds. The truth is that you were brought into being to rule over everything. Make haste and eat before God creates other worlds that will dominate you. And Eve saw how plausible were the words of the serpent, and she tasted the fruit. This midrash adds significantly to the biblical version, and having suggested to Eve that God himself gained his powers from eating from the tree of knowledge. While the serpent's original comments promised Eve knowledge, they did not imply that God obtained his knowledge in this way. But the rabbis reading between the lines saw a hint of such a meaning in the serpent's comments and made this hint explicit. To do so is to belittle God's unique powers, and it turns the serpent into a heretic. Thus, the midrash may be viewed as aimed not only at the serpent, but at those with Gnostic views who fail to acknowledge God's unique powers of creators of the world. We're going to get even further into myths of Adam and Eve's relationship with the serpent. So how was Cain conceived? Remember, basic biblical story. You have Adam and Eve. They eat the fruit. They're expelled from the garden. And then we read that the couple has two children, Cain and Abel. Samael was a great prince in heaven. So we have stories of hosts of heaven with angelic kinds of creatures, and in Jewish mythology, they have names. After God created the world, Samael took his band of followers and descended and saw the creatures that God had created. Among them, he found no one so skilled to do evil as the serpent. As it is said, now the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts. Its appearance was something like that of a camel, and Samael mounted it and rode upon it. Riding on the serpent, the angel Samael came to Eve in the night and seduced her, and she conceived Cain. Later, when Eve was pregnant by the angel, Adam came to her, and she conceived Abel. So Samael conceives Cain in this midrash, and Adam conceives is the father of Abel. Others say it was the serpent herself who seduced Eve. For after he saw Adam and Eve coupling, the serpent conceived a passion for her. He even imagined killing Adam and marrying Eve. So he came to Eve when she was alone and possessed her and infused her with lust. That is how the serpent fathered Cain, who was later to slay his own brother. And that is how Eve was infected with his impurity. Or as a result, all Israel was impure from that time until the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. Only then did Israel's impurity cease. When Cain was born, Adam knew at once he was not of his seed, for he was not after his likeness or after his image. Instead, Cain's appearance was that of a heavenly being. And when Eve saw his appearance was not of this world, she said, I have gained a male child with the aid or help of Yahweh. It was not until the birth of Seth. Seth is a child which comes along much later, that Adam has a son who is in his own likeness and image. From Seth arose all the generations of the righteous, while all those generations that descended from the seed of Cain are wicked until this very day. Yeah, this is just a commentary. Let's move on. The wives of Cain and Abel. Where did the wives of Cain and Abel come from? That's actually a great question. This, Spencer Tracy asks us in a great movie, Inherit the Wind, about the Scopes monkey trial. And, Spencer Tracy is cross-examining. I can't remember the character, but the, Bible thumping character that maintains that everything in the Bible is correct. And he's reading and he said, and then, Cain knew his wife and they had children. And so Spencer Tracy famously asked him, where did his wife come from? And of course, in the text, she's just not mentioned. So where did the wives of Cain and Abel come from? On the day that Adam and Eve were created, on that very day they coupled, and on that very day they produced offspring. It is said that 2 entered the bed and 7 left it. For Cain was born with a twin sister, and Abel was born with 2 sisters. Cain married Abel's twin, and Abel married Cain's, but they could not agree on the fate of Abel's second twin. Indeed, it is said that she was the subject of the dispute between the 2 brothers, out of which Cain slew his brother Abel, and the voices of the bloods of the family who were destined to issue forth from Abel cried out before God. So this is classic Midrash. There's a question in the text, so Midrash is going to rush to fill it. Okay. Oh, actually, we've gotten through the Garden of Eden. So I'll pause for a second and just ask any questions or comments or anything you want to discuss about the Garden of Eden.
Anybody? Okay.
I'll mention one thing which I think is kind of fun, and that is, how did Chava become Eve? So in the text, the first woman's name is Chava, which is derived from the word chai, meaning life, because she was the mother of all living beings. And of course, we know her as Eve. So the question is, how did Chava become Eva? And the answer is that in the Septuagint, which is the first Greek translation, it's a Jewish translation, it turns out there is no sound in Greek corresponding to the juicy chet. So we have Chava, and the Greeks couldn't say, so they just got rid of the, and they left the Eva, and that's how Chava in Greek becomes Eva, and in English, she becomes Eve.
Thank you for that. I never knew.
In case that was keeping you up at night.
It was.
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. So now, focus on the Messiah. So we're going to close the discussion, and we may not go as overtime as I thought we might. We're going to close the discussion with the discussion of the Messiah. And I talk about the Messiah a lot. I think most of you know I wrote a book for Christians about Judaism, and as a result, I speak to far more Christians than I do to Jews, particularly Catholics, because the book is published by a Catholic publisher. So as I begin this, I always emphasize, and it's worth mentioning here, because Judaism's focuses on this world and what we are to do in the world, and not so much on what we are to believe. We are more than free to speculate, wonder, dream, explore, imagine, and enjoy a wide array of myths without imposing theological problems or accusations of heresy. Christianity is much more about what is proper belief. Judaism is much more about what is proper actions, what we call mitzvahs, mitzvot. So therefore, in this whole discussion of all this mythology, we will see myths that raise all kinds of problems, and we don't necessarily worry about the problems that they raise or inconsistencies. And we'll see that a lot in the discussion of the Messiah. But by and large, Jews were not so interested in coming up with what we would call theology. If you think about it, theology is an organized description of the nature of God, the nature of humanity, the nature of religion. Just, what am I supposed to believe as a member of this religion? That would be theology. That element really is not addressed in Jewish writing until about 1,000 years ago. And it's really under the influence of Islam. So about 1,000 years ago, you have Muslim philosophers who are, because they're very interested in Aristotle, they want to come up with an organized theology of Islam. And this happens in Spain. And you have Jewish philosophers, the most notable of which is Maimonides in Spain, the Rambam. And so he decides he needs to come up with a organized theology for the perplexed. And indeed, his book is called The Guide for the Perplexed. But up until that point, we were just sort of happy to argue in the Talmud and in rabbinic debates about what is it you're supposed to do. So, what's the theology of God? Well, we can have this great discussion. If you want to know what foods you should eat and not eat, next week, once Passover begins, their Judaism is going to get very, very specific for people who are observant. And I think I'm going to close with a song about that. So, myths of the Messiah. And there's just a bunch of images about the Messiah. And of course, there was a series on Netflix. I don't know if it's still on, which is actually pretty good. And it just speculates with a guy coming out of the Middle East who gradually, it seems pretty clear that this guy is the Messiah. And clearly it's fictional. It's not the story of Jesus, but it sort of speculates on what would happen if somebody arose today and how would the world accept them. And of course, we have great music, and we have this wonderful phrase, David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayom, David, King of Israel, lives and endures. Sandra, yeah, you need to unmute.
There are people all the time that come and say that they're the Messiah, and we just figure they're nuts and lock them up.
Well, sometimes we do that, but there have been in Jewish history, I would say, more than a dozen people who came and claimed to be the Messiah and had a significant following. I mean, they talk about this in Israel, the Messiah complex. People show up and they think that they're the Messiah. And I was just watching. It's I think the 30th anniversary of Waco, and David Koresh clearly believed he was the Messiah and God. So yeah, so that happens. But we have Jesus. We have Bar Kokhba, who is proclaimed to be the Messiah by a personage no less than Rabbi Akiva. And it didn't hurt Akiva's reputation when he realized he was wrong, when the Bar Kokhba revolt failed. And then there's another one which is super interesting, which is Shabtai Tzvi in the 1600s, who had a huge following that lasted several hundred years. And again, we can talk about that one. And one other guy. And this I took as a picture in Israel. You don't hear Chabad talk about this that much anymore, but here is Mental Schneerson, the late Chabad rabbi, and it says Melech HaMashiach, the King Messiah, and Yechai Adonenu Morenu Uvrabenu Melech HaMashiach Leolam Va'ed. He lives and endures. Our Lord, our teacher, our Rabbi, King Messiah, forever and ever. And I just want to note that Burger King is not recognized in Israel as a Messiah. This actually just says Burger King. Okay.
Michael,
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I came off the freeway to LA few days ago, and there was a giant billboard that said Mashiach, and it
Oh.
was Mendel,
It was
Schneerson.
Schneerson, yeah.
And you just look at that and you think, isn't that a different religion that the Messiah has arrived?
This is a what? I'm sorry.
Isn't that another religion? The one that
Yeah.
says that there's a
So
Messiah.
actually, we're going to
He's
see the
coming back.
myth. We're going to see the myth that leads them to this. But I had a book. I don't think I have it anymore, about Schneerson, by an author who says, for normative Judaism, the idea that the Messiah would live, die, and come back is heresy. It's Christianity. It's not Judaism. And his point, the author's point, was that it's the nature of Judaism that what counts is how you follow the mitzvot.
Mhm.
And this is actually a perfect example. As long as Chabad ties their tzitzit correctly and creates their tefillin correctly and has the Shabbat rules followed and the Passover rules followed, a heresy as big as Messiah, no one I'm not aware of any serious attempt to to expel Chabad from the world of Judaism. I can't remember to defrock Chabad and say it's not really Judaism. As much as people will say Reform Judaism isn't really Judaism, I don't know of a corresponding attempt to say that Chabad has committed such a horrible heresy that they've left the world of Judaism. So just to underline the Jewish understanding of Messiah, the English word Messiah is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach means anointed. The kings of Israel were gained their throne by pouring holy oil on their head. The verb to anoint is Mashach. One who is anointed is Mashiach. There are 39 references to this word Mashiach in the Hebrew Bible, and not one refers to a future redeemer. It always refers to someone who was in fact a king of Israel. When the Hebrew is translated into Greek about 200 years BCE, it's a Jewish translation. When you're translating into Greek and they get to the word Mashiach, they need to find a Greek word to mean anointed, and the Greek word they use is Christos. So from which, of course, we get the word Christ. So I talk about Jesus a lot in interfaith settings. I never refer to Jesus as Christ, because if I were referring to him as Christ, I would be, through a few levels of translation, talking about him being Messiah. And by the way, you get you've probably seen for Christmas Xmas, right? That's the reason is the first letter in Christos is the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. That's just almost as useful as knowing how Chava became Eve. Okay, so Jewish understanding of Messiah, and as we'll see, there are lots of speculation about the nature of Messiah. This is sort of the normative Jewish understanding of Messiah: fully human and only human, a political or military ruler like King David, not God in any sense, nor the child of God in any sense other than we are all children of God, not connected with the redemption of sin. As we know in Jewish thought, only we can atone for our sins, for sins against God, like blasphemy, eating non-kosher food, violating the Sabbath, and so on. We believe that God is both just and forgiving. And we have a day, Yom Kippur, for forgiveness of sin. But we also teach, and this is a huge difference between Judaism and Christianity, that Judaism teaches that for sins against others, God cannot forgive those sins until we've achieved the forgiveness of the person we've offended. And as most Jews know, Messiah is not at the heart of Judaism. In fact, I'm curious whether, Rabbi Singer, you have the same experience. I would say, other than to maybe talk about Chabad or talk about differences between Jewish and Christian understandings of Messiah, I never speak to my congregations about Messiah. And
I don't either.
Yeah. And, I think there's far more material in the Encyclopedia Judaica on Maimonides than on Messiah. So there are lots of Jewish prophecies concerning Messiah. They pretty much all agree on this: a time of peace on earth, peace among people, peace among animals, lion lying down with the lamb, and Suzanne's dog and cat will get along. All the world will come to know the one God, and the details are unresolved. And we'll see this. The mystics see this as a supernatural time. The rationalists believe that we do the work to make the world perfect. And I would say Reform Judaism embraces the idea of a messianic age rather than an individual Messiah. So this is, I always use this. This is my handy dandy test. Has the Messiah come? Read your local newspaper from cover to cover every day. If there's no story of war, hatred, hunger, or disease, the Messiah may have come. I can easily update all the the headlines here. Clearly, it hasn't come. Yeah, so why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? Quite simply, no world peace, no Messiah. Christian response to that is Jesus will come a second time to fulfill those prophecies. In fact, Jesus, I've said this a lot in a lot of different settings, and neither lightning nor a Christian has struck me down for saying it. Jesus doesn't fulfill a single Jewish prophecy concerning Messiah and the Messianic age. So the second coming, beautiful idea, not Jewish. But the larger issue is not whether Jesus was the Messiah, it's whether Jesus is God. The idea of God taking human form, suffering us and dying for our sins is quite beautiful, but it's not Jewish. That's why I have great respect for Christianity, but I have less respect for Messianic Jews or Jews for Jesus, because I believe Messianic Jews and Jews for Jesus are really funded and supported by Christians who want to convert us to Christianity without us really realizing we're converting to Christianity. As I always say, the issue is not as who is Jesus, but the issue is who is God. Okay, so let's look at some of the myths of Messiah. So Schwartz's book, which I'm taking my material from, contains 63 separate myths of the Messiah. So I had to be pretty selective here. The scales of the Messiah. The Messiah was created when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. At that time, God commanded Elijah the prophet to bring scales to him. On one side of the scales, Elijah would place the captive Messiah along with the souls for the dead, and Elijah would fill the other scale with tears, torture, and souls of the tzaddikim, the righteous. And when this had been done, God announced the face of the Messiah will be seen when the scales were balanced. This orally collected myth portrays the conditions that would enable the coming of the Messiah, a balancing of heavenly scales with the Messiah on one side and the souls of the dead, the suffering of Israel, and the souls of the tzaddikim on the other. The idea is that God is well aware of the suffering of Israel, and when the time is right, he will send the Messiah to ease that suffering. This suggests a kind of heavenly mechanism to trigger the Messianic era and the end of days. I don't think I have specific myths on this, but there's all kinds of discussions that if every Jew on earth rigorously observed 2 Shabbats in a row, the Messiah would come. I heard of another myth that there's some huge vat in the heavens, and it is filled with the tears of the Jews. And when it's finally full, that will signal the time of the coming of the Messiah. The requirements of the Messiah. King Messiah will arise and restore the kingdom of David to its former glory. By the way, in this David stories, God promises David, even though he commits some pretty serious sins, murder and adultery and others, that the throne of Israel will always come from his house, from David's house, from David's line. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So the idea is, since we believe God fulfills God's promises, that someday another king will be on the throne of Israel from the house of David. And that king, of course, will be anointed. So he will be, in Hebrew terms, Mashiach.
Michael, you're not sharing your screen, just in case you thought you were.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I stopped when we, Yeah, I apologize. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah. So yeah, King Messiah will arise and restore the kingdom of David to its former glory. He will rebuild the temple and gather all the exiles of Israel. All the ancient laws will be reinstituted in his days. Sacrifices will again be offered. The sabbatical and jubilee years again will be observed according to the commandments set forth in the Torah. This statement by Maimonides, so this is from the Mishnah Torah, is quite definitive, except that it doesn't include the resurrection of the dead, the last of Maimonides' own 13 principles. Indeed, in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides denies that the Messiah will bring the dead to life. Quote, "Do not think that King Messiah will have to perform signs and wonders or bring anything new into being, revive the dead, or do similar things." The two other major requirements of the Messiah were listed here by Maimonides, the rebuilding of the temple and the ingathering of the exiles. Thus, Maimonides downplays the supernatural events in the Messianic tradition, viewing the Messiah, the Messianic era, in practical terms that could be accomplished without overthrowing the laws of nature. Indeed, he states this explicitly, that no one think that in the days of the Messiah, any laws of nature will be set aside, or any innovation be introduced into creation. The world will follow its normal course. As we will see in other Jewish mythology, the rabbis do speak of the resurrection of the dead as in the day of the Messiah. The descent of the Messiah's soul. So this is going to introduce a very mystical concept, which we've hinted at before, that the Messiah actually right now is residing somewhere in heaven. And we're going to hear about the palaces of the Messiah and so on. So the Messiah's soul is in the heavens. The soul of the Messiah lives in a palace in heaven. There's a potential Messiah born on earth in every generation. That person, known as the Tzaddik Hador, the righteous one of the generation, the most righteous of his generation, has both an earthly soul and a heavenly soul. If the time is right for the Messiah to come, then the heavenly soul will descend and fuse with the earthly soul, and the days of the Messiah will have arrived. In recent times, some members of the Lubavitch Hasidism, which is what we call Chabad, came to believe strongly that their Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, was the Messiah. In addition to a public campaign for Messiah Now, Lubavitch theologians searched the existing messianic traditions for evidence that the Rebbe, as he was universally known, was the Messiah. Here they encountered two apparently contradictory traditions. One holds that the Messiah is a divine figure who makes his home in a heavenly palace. The other tradition holds that the Messiah will be the Tzaddik Hador, the greatest sage of his generation, a human being. These were originally two separate messianic traditions in Judaism, but they were eventually linked. The earthly human Messiah was identified as Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah, the son of Joseph rather than David, who was said to pave the way for the heavenly Messiah, known as Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son of David. However, this myth held that the Messiah ben Yosef would lose his life in the process. Before the death of the Rebbe, Jacob Emanuel Shochet, a prominent Lubavitch scholar, often lectured on the subject of the Messiah. There was no doubt that his descriptions of the qualities of the Messiah were intended to refer to the Rebbe. In these lectures, Shochet presented a new messianic theory, combining the myths of the Messiah ben Joseph and the Messiah ben David into a single myth. Here, rather than having one Messiah prepare the way for the other, the figure of the Messiah was simultaneously human and divine. Sounds a lot like Christianity. This was made possible by the descent of the soul of the heavenly Messiah into the body of the human one. Thus, in the Lubavitch view, the heavenly Messiah himself will not descend, but merely his soul, which will fuse with the soul of the human Messiah. This made it possible to explain how a human, such as the Rebbe, could fulfill the role of Messiah ben David, the heavenly Messiah. Now, it's interesting, this quote's from Ezra in here. Now, for Ezra, I'm not sure. That may be Apocrypha, not Hebrew Bible. I'm actually not certain about that. and the Lubavitch oral tradition. And as I remember in hearing about this, one of the problems is the Rebbe did not leave a male heir. And in the world of Hasidic Judaism, it's the son of the Rebbe who becomes the next Rebbe. And actually, even Schneerson was the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe because he didn't leave a male heir either. But Schneerson had a very bad stroke in his last years and was unable to communicate. So I mean, I read a story where they're asking him, "Are you the Messiah?" Because he doesn't leave any instructions on the future of Chabad. And there is no Rebbe of Chabad. There's lots of Hasidic movements, and they all have a Rebbe except for Chabad. And so, according to the story I read, he grunts, and people took that as a yes. The Messiah will descend from the side of evil. And I apologize, for all the male references to God. That's the way it is in these texts. And rather than me kind of fumble and autocorrect as I read, I'm just going to read what's written. For reasons known only to him, God caused events to occur whereby the Messiah will be born from the realm of evil. For the Messiah will descend from the house of David. And King David was descended from Ruth the Moabite. And Moab was the son of one of the two daughters of Lot. After the destruction of Sodom, Lot, who was intoxicated, committed incest with his daughters. Thus, when God said, "I have found David," where did he find him? In Sodom. Thus, the soul of the Messiah is descended from that place. If the Messiah was to descend from a righteous person rather than the incestuous Lot, no enemy would have been able to prevail against Israel or cause them to be forced into exile. God ordained things to happen this way, although no one knows why. David wanted to banish the evil side from which he had been born, eliminating it from the world, but he was unable to do so, for he had no power over the side of evil, since he had been born of it. In the Zohar and in later Kabbalistic and Hasidic commentaries, the incestuous union of Lot and his daughters in Genesis is identified as the source of the power of the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse. This leads to the mysterious conclusion that the Messiah will descend from the side of evil. The key concept here is that the Messiah's soul is closest to evil, creating a great intensity. But in the Messianic age, the evil soul will be transformed by a process of tikkun, repair or restoration, into the good. And I have, yes, I have this. I have a class. I think I have it in 2 sessions, and it's on my website. I don't know if I think I may even, yeah. So here it is. The class is called Illicit Sexual Encounters in the Bible. We will be carefully reading some of the most interesting and unusual stories in the Hebrew Bible, ones you never ever studied in Hebrew school, a careful review of the lineage of King David and the Messiah, and what it teaches about your family and mine, and the ultimate task of redemption. So I have the videos of those 2 on, and this is kind of the bottom line. It's very, very, very interesting that if you look at the line of David and the Messiah, as presented in the Bible, there are a lot of strange sexual unions that give rise to the birth of Messiah. So for one thing, the one that was just mentioned in the last slide is Lot and his daughters. So when God goes to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot escapes. Lot's wife famously turns around and looks behind her and is turned into a pillar of salt. So now it's just Lot and his daughters, and they're hiding out in a cave. And the text actually says that the daughters think that they are the last 3 people in the world. So they want to preserve humanity. So they get their father drunk and have intercourse with him and have children. So you have 2 children. One is called Moab, from which the Moabites come, And of course, Moab means from daddy. What a perfect name to give the child of incest. And the other is Amnon, from which we get the group of Ammonites. And then I know this is pretty small, but in Deuteronomy it says, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord ever. So, and historically, these were probably peoples that attacked and fought with the Israelites. So again, looking at it from a scholarly point of view, I would say this was the Bible's way of getting back at them, and and saying they're such horrible people. They're all the product of incest, and we should never ever admit them. So that's on. We're going to get down to Ruth in a minute. But meanwhile, back with the patriarchs, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Jacob has a son named Judah. That's where we get the word Jew. And Judah has 3 sons. And the first one marries a woman named Tamar, and he drops dead. And then his younger brother is required to marry Tamar, and he drops dead also. And then, so then Judah doesn't want to risk his 3rd son marrying Tamar, so he sends her off. And then, the story gets involved. It's the book of Ruth. It's the entire book of Ruth. Oh no, I'm sorry, though. This is all in Genesis, not the book of Ruth. He basically, Tamar dresses up as a prostitute and seduces Judah. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Seduces Judah and has a child by Judah. So this is with her father-in-law. Very interesting story. She gets pregnant and she has a child named Perez. 4 generations later, we have one of the children is named Salmon, and Salmon gives birth to Boaz. We're going to pick up Boaz in the book of Ruth. And then in both in the New Testament and the book of Joshua, we have Salmon marrying Rahab, who's a prostitute, and give birth to Boaz. The entire book of Ruth is about Ruth finally settling down and marrying Boaz, even though over and over again in the book of Ruth, it is emphasized that Ruth is a Moabitess who is not to be admitted ever into the people Israel. So she marries Boaz, and their great-grandchild is David, who, oh, by the way, produces a child with Bathsheba, and he has committed adultery with Bathsheba. So therefore, without some rabbinic juggling, Solomon would be a mamzer, but the rabbis get David off the hook there, and eventually we get the Messiah. And I don't have the slide on this, but it's really interesting. I learned this from Norman Cohen. I don't know, Suzanne, did you ever study with Norman Cohen out of New York?
I did. Yes,
yeah.
I did.
Yeah. So he, if you read the opening verses of the New Testament, this is the book of Matthew. The very opening verses of the book of Matthew, which Rabbi Cohen, Professor Cohen, says is clearly a Jewish midrash, a Jewish genealogy. They talk about all the begats, Abraham begot Isaac, begot Jacob, begot Judah. There are almost no women mentioned except the ones on this page. The only women mentioned in the genealogy in the New Testament are these strange unions of prostitutes and unions of forbidden people, like people from Moab. And by the way, according to Kings, even one of Solomon's wives who gives birth to another king is an Ammonite. So then the question I always ask at the end of this is, what in the world is going on here? Why does our texts seem to go out of its way to have these very bizarre sexual unions giving rise to the Messiah? And this is purely my take on this, but it's not so different than, well, it's pretty different than the last one. But my take on this is that from a Jewish perspective, redemption will arise from people just as crazy as your family and mine, rather than coming from some sort of perfection. Clearly in Christianity, Jesus is born without sin, born without original sin, is absolutely perfect, is never tempted. I think in Muslim tradition, Muhammad is treated very similarly. But in Jewish tradition, the Messiah will come out of a line with that will remind you of your own family, or my family. I won't say anything about your families. So yeah, so I have this. If you're interested in the stories in detail, you can go to my website. Well, back to, I'm going to take a drink. If somebody has a question, you can chime in. Back to the myths of the Messiah, the ladder of prayers. The Baal Shem Tov, who is the originator of Hasidic Judaism in the 1700s, was once praying with his Hasidim. That day he prayed with great concentration, not only word by word, but letter by letter, so that others finished long before he did. At first they waited for him, but before long they lost patience, and one by one they left. I once learned, I think this was from Mordechai Finley, of a spiritual tradition of praying the Amidah, can't do this and still remain in the picture, taking, I don't know, like a minute per word. So you go, instead of Baruch Atah Adonai, it would be Baruch. And then you spend just a minute thinking about the word Baruch. And now the Amidah is a long prayer, so you could spend most of the day doing that. And that's my image here of what the Baal Shem Tov was doing. So his students give up and they leave. Later, the Baal Shem Tov came to them and said, while I was praying, I ascended the ladder of your prayers all the way into paradise. As I ascended, I heard a song of indescribable beauty. At last I reached the palace of the Messiah in the highest heavens, known as the bird's nest. The Messiah was standing by his window, peering out at a tree of great beauty. I followed his gaze and saw that his eyes were fixed on a golden dove, whose nest was at the top branches of the tree. That is when I realized that the song pervading all of paradise was coming from that golden dove. And I understood that the Messiah could not bear to be without the dove and its song for as much as a moment. Then it occurred to me, if I could capture the dove and bring it back to the world, the Messiah would be sure to follow. So I ascended higher until I was within arm's grasp of the golden dove. But just as I reached for it, the ladder of prayers collapsed. The students gave up on their rabbis praying and went out to have lunch. Like that. The captive Messiah. For many generations, the Messiah has sat captive, chained with golden chains before the throne of glory. Elijah has tried to release him many times, but he has never succeeded. So Elijah descends to earth and explains that in order to break the chains of Messiah, he needs a magic saw whose teeth are the deeds of Israel. Every deed adds a tooth to the saw, but every sin takes one away. When there are twice as many good deeds as there are sins, then the saw can be used. That is why it is said that the Messiah will not come until we bring him. A number of texts describe the Messiah as bound in chain. According to Pirkei Chechalot Rabbi Tai, for example, God will tie up the Messiah hand and foot for 8 years, and during the years that the Messiah is fettered, God will hide his face from him. This is a reminder that the decision of bringing the end of days, which the Messiah will herald, does not belong to the Messiah but to God, or to the people Israel, whose good deeds will make it possible. According to the complexity, there are even myths in which God himself is in chains, and they make reference to this. I always think that, for me, one of the most powerful insights of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, is that God can't bring about the redemption of the earth, that God has made us partners in the redemption of the earth, and it's really up to us to release the sparks to repair the world, what we call tikkun olam. I think we're getting, yeah, we'll read this. This is actually right from Ezekiel, so this is not from Kabbalah or Zohar. So many people point to this as a source of the idea of resurrection. So this is Ezekiel speaking. The hand of the Lord came upon me. He took me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them, and there were very many of them spread over the valley. Excuse me. He said to me, O mortal, can these bones live again? I replied, O Lord God, only you know. And he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. You know them bones, dry bones. And he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live again. I will lay sinews upon you and cover you with flesh, and form skin over you. And I will put breath into you, and you shall live again, and you shall know that I am the Lord. I prophesied, and as I had been commanded. And while I was prophesying, suddenly there was a sound of rattling, and the bones came together, bone to matching bone. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and flesh had grown, and skin had formed over them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, O mortal, say to the breath, thus says the Lord, come, O breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live again. I prophesied as he commanded me. The breath entered them, and they came to life, and they stood upon their feet, a vast multitude. This is generally understood not to be talking about individual resurrection, but the resurrection of the people, Israel. Oh, it continues. And he said to me, O mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Yeah, here we go. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone, and we are doomed. Prophesy, therefore, and say to them, thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves and lift you out of the graves, O my people, and bring you to the land of Israel. You shall know, O my people, that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves and lifted you out of your graves. I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and have acted, declares the Lord. The belief in bodily resurrection of the dead can be traced to this powerful biblical myth of Ezekiel, in which God compels him to resurrect with his prophesying the bones in the valley of dry bones. Here, God's intention is to bring the people of Israel back to life, is presented as an explicit promise with a powerful demonstration of God's ability to fulfill it. In Messianic myth, the resurrection of the dead becomes one of the three primary requirements that must be fulfilled to initiate the Messianic era. The others are the ingathering of Israel, of the exiles, and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. I think I'm almost done. Sherry, yeah.
You want to stop sharing for a sec?
Yeah.
Is-
I'll stop sharing. Remind me to
So
continue.
in that resurrection of the dead, would that refer to what Christians call the end of days? Would that, are they?
Yeah,
taking
so
mess?
I would say yes, and they get it from us.
Right.
A primary distinction of rabbinic teaching, which is, the idea of resurrection of the dead, and end of days is not in the Bible at all. But around the time of Jesus, and before the time of Jesus, you had this newfangled idea of rabbis who believed that Moses not only got the written Torah, but the oral Torah. And one of the hallmarks of rabbinic teaching was this idea of the resurrection of the dead in the day of the coming of the Messiah, which is sometimes called the end of days. And Christianity just adopted this idea. So it's something we actually share with Christianity. Very good question.
Other questions, comments?
Go back to sharing. I think I'm almost
Okay,
done.
go back to sharing.
Yeah, I can. Okay. Oops. Oops. Resurrection of the dead. God keeps the souls of the dead alive, and the dead wait, their eyes fixed upon resurrection. The patriarchs sought to be buried in the land of Israel because the dead in the land of Israel will be the first to come to life. Not only Abraham and Sarah are buried there, but also Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. So too are Adam and Eve said to be buried nearby. In the days preceding the coming of the Messiah, great events will befall the world. 10 territories will be swallowed up, 10 territories will be overturned, and 10 territories will have their inhabitants put to death. When the Messiah comes, all mankind, the quick and those who were dead, will be one in the worship of God. In those days, the dead of the land of Israel will be the first to come back to life. The angel Michael will blow a great blast on the shofar, and the tombs of the dead will burst open in Jerusalem, and God will revive them. When the resurrection comes, those who arise from the dead will see the eternal Spirit returning to Zion through the gate of mercy. This gate has been blocked for many generations. Therefore, it is said of this gate, that it will not be opened until the eyes of Israel are opened at the end of days. In the days of the Messiah, God will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and Israel will go up in pilgrimage, not 3 times a year, but on every new moon and Sabbath. How will it be possible for all flesh to come to Jerusalem? In those days, Jerusalem is destined to be as large as the land of Israel, and the land of Israel as large as the whole world. And how can they come from the ends of the earth? Clouds will carry the children of Israel to Jerusalem, where they will say their prayers. And then the clouds will carry them back to their homes, as it is said from Isaiah, who are those that float like a cloud? Then the walls of Jerusalem will disappear, and the Messiah will rebuild them with precious stones and pearls. The resurrected dead will inhabit this new Jerusalem, and they will be like Adam before he sinned. After that, the bones of the righteous outside the land will roll through underground caves until they reach the Mount of Olives in the city of Jerusalem. There God will restore their souls to them, and they will arise and enjoy the days of the Messiah along with those who have already come alive in the land. And those who are resurrected will not die again and return to dust. But just as God endures forever, so they will live forever. God will give them wings, and they will float in the air and fly like angels to the Garden of Eden, where they will learn Torah from God. Sounds good. And so this is the origin of placing earth from the land of Israel into graves. And quite often at a funeral, Jewish cemeteries, they will have packets of earth from the Mount of Olives. And I always think of this as kind of like giving the bloodhound something to smell. So you have a little bit of land from the Holy Land in the grave. So when the Messiah comes and you tunnel your way to Jerusalem, you will know the Holy Land once you find it. The world to come. So the world to come is used actually 2 ways. It's called Olam Haba in Hebrew. It's used to represent both the what happens to you immediately after you die, and also what was referred to as the end of days. So there are no bodies in the world to come, only the souls of the righteous, who are bodiless, like ministering angels. Since there are no bodies, there is no eating or drinking, nor anything that human bodies require in this world. So too there is no sleep or death, sadness or mirth. That is why the sages said, the world to come has neither eating nor drinking nor sex in it, but the righteous will sit with their crowns on their heads and enjoy the splendor of Shekhinah. Thus the souls of the righteous exist there without toil. But the knowledge that they acquired in their lifetime remains with them. Indeed, because of it, they merited the life of the world to come. Thus, the crowns that they wear are the crowns of knowledge. And there, in the world to come, they enjoy the splendor of Shekhinah, for now they can grasp the truth of God that they did not know when they were burdened with a body. Whoever believes in the two world, this world and the world to come, will be considered a descendant of Abraham. But whoever does not will not be considered his seed. This is my favorite. It's Franz Kafka, who is not actually considered to be a Jewish prophet, but he is Jewish. The Messiah will not come until he is no longer needed. He will not come until a day after his arrival. He will not come on the last day, but on the last of all. Kafka's paradoxical explanation of when the Messiah will come is so intriguing that it deserves a place in this collection of Jewish myths. It also reflects traditional Jewish teachings about the Messiah. The coming of the Messiah represents the initiation of the end of days, the Messianic era in which all of existence will be transformed, a return to the pre-lapsarian condition, or I guess that refers to before the sin in the garden, or a kind of heaven on earth. For this reason, the arrival of the Messiah is not important. It's in itself. Rather, it is the transformation that accompanies the arrival that matters. This is one way of understanding Kafka's comment that the Messiah will not come until he is no longer needed. I understand this as Kafka saying, and I think this fits very much into Reformed theology and to my own theology, is that it's up to us to make the world a better, even close to perfect place. And if we do that work, the Messiah will come to say Mazel Tov. But it's not the Messiah working some kind of magic in the world. It's up to us to do the hard work of making this world a better place. And that will bring about the Messianic age. So I actually said this after I taught this class 3 or 4 years ago. And there are lots of other great candidates for Jewish mythology, and someday I'll put together another class. So actually, I think this is all in his book. We haven't touched upon myths of God, myths of creation, myths of heaven, the holy word, holy time, holy people, holy land, and exile. So there's lots of material. And that is what I wanted to cover. So, and didn't run too much over. So I want to ask if there's any other questions. And if not, I will have a closing song for you, one of my usuals. Okay, so hearing none, it turns out in Jewish tradition, rabbis generally did not give sermons. That's sort of a modern innovation, probably copying Christian tradition, with a major exception, and that is on the Sabbath that is coming. The Sabbath that is coming this weekend is called Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Sabbath, the Sabbath before Passover, and the rabbi would give a sermon. Can any of you guess what the rabbi would speak about traditionally on the Sabbath just before Passover? What do you think the rabbi would want the congregation to most know as we enter Passover?
We
Think
were
about-
once slaves.
Sorry, say again?
We were once slaves.
We were slaves, but that's the story. Think about Jewish law. What Jewish laws do you think the rabbi would want to remind us of as we're getting ready to enter Passover?
Chametz, get rid of your chametz.
Yes, and so get rid of your chametz. And is that the only thing you worry about on Passover? You're generally worrying about what you shouldn't eat, and that's really what Rabbi is saying by getting rid of your chametz. So, of course, taking this quite seriously and musically, I decided that this deserves a musical rendition, which I call non-Pesadic things. Pesadic is I'm sure it's a Yiddish word, which means kosher for Passover. And I'm sure you will recognize the melody. Bagels and muffins and chocolate Oreos, spaghetti and pizza we order from Domino's. Pies that are crusty and even ring-dings fall in the list of non-Pesadic things. Fritos and Cheetos and Wheaties each morning, along with the Pop-Tarts and croissants we're scorning. Bye-bye to the donuts with sugar icing. All in the list of non-Pesadic things. So for 8 days, we're all amazed with the matzah we eat. And looking forward unto the 9th day and to the following treats, cupcakes and cheesecakes and forbidden Twinkies, popcorn and peanuts and sugary drinkies, Danish and French toast, burritos so hot, and even next Friday, challah for Shabbat. So long matzah, so long X-lax, so long bowls of prunes. And for the next 357 days, I'm swearing off macaroons. That's my Shabbat sermon.
Standing.
Bravo, Rabbi.
Thank you, thank you.
Rabbi
And-
Singer, can you stay on for a minute?
I'm
Sorry?
going to stay on for more than a minute.
Sure.
But first, I would like to thank Rabbi Lotker for a wonderful series and for entertaining us with his clever singing, which I first
very
learned
welcome.
about when I was in seminary with him. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording. Let's see, stop recording. There we go.